Good afternoon to you. Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com here with your off-season edition of the Hurricane Outlook and Discussion. I try to do these at least once per week during the off-season months of December through May. On the lookout for different larger climate signals, puzzle pieces as it were, that might shape next year's hurricane season in the Atlantic and elsewhere, as well as looking out for trouble spots, any big-ticket massive winter storms, especially along the East Coast, and other weather that could affect those in the lower 48. Just kind of giving you a heads up. I am not a winter storm expert, so to speak, but I certainly know what to look for and kind of point it out and maybe raise awareness to a travel nightmare that might be in your way if you're heading somewhere or know somebody who is. That's kind of the gist of what we do here during the off season. Always something to talk about. And that being said, let's take a look as part of the first stop of our tour at the sea surface temperature anomalies. This was updated on the 12th, yesterday. And you notice a few things that should stand out pretty prominently. The La Nina pattern of cold anomalies along the equatorial region of the tropical Pacific here. And then really the rest of the Pacific colder than it should be in a lot of places here. As a whole, the Pacific cooling off. And that is significant to me because the warmer Pacific that we saw in 2014, 2015, and to some extent for a good deal of this year, especially through this region and here, really led to some down hurricane seasons in the Atlantic. And it wasn't until this kind of faded off a little bit that the Atlantic came to life, and we ended up with a slightly busier than average season in the Atlantic Basin. Speaking of that, in the deep tropics here, the anomaly is running pretty much above normal, even in the subtropics up here. This is a very warm look to the Atlantic Ocean right now, and the AMO, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, there are a couple of different ways to look at it, but from what I have seen, for the most part, it's running above the long-term average, and fairly significantly so. We will wait to hear from one of the leading experts in this field, Dr. Phil Klotzbach from Colorado State University, coming up fairly soon when he issues his first thoughts on next year's hurricane season, and hopefully he will discuss a little bit about the current warm conditions in the Atlantic Basin. That would be helpful. So these are the things that we'll be watching. You notice very, very warm anomalies here in the northwest Atlantic. We're talking about towards the right-hand side of the scale, 3, 4, 5 degrees Celsius and higher above the long-term average. And those anomalies go right up against the coastline here. So that'll make for some interesting nor'easters possibly later on in the year. We'll have to wait and see about that. Now, one of the drivers in all of this, and sometimes you have to wonder what drives what. Does the ocean drive the atmosphere? Is it vice versa? Obviously, I think it's a mix of both. But what driver sets things off? Sometimes you have different things that will happen in the atmosphere with pressure changes over a large scale that will sort of set things in motion. And one of those is the Southern Oscillation Index. And that is a difference between the pressure in Tahiti, in the tropical Pacific, the Southwest Pacific, and Darwin in Australia. And really the easiest way to think of this, when the SOI is substantially negative, then we are typically in more of an El Nino pattern, and the trade winds have lessened or even reversed in some cases, and you have a lot more of a westerly wind component across the tropical Pacific, which is not what we're used to. And conversely, when the SOI is positive, and strongly so, we're more in a La Nina type pattern. So what has it been lately? Well, fortunately, the folks here from Queensland government in Australia that run the long paddock site here keep track of this on a daily basis, usually, and so we get a nice calculation. And so today's contributor is negative, minus 2.91, if I can talk. And the 90-day is, just a little bit this side of positive at 1.41, and then the 30-day average is slightly negative. You can just kind of round it down to -1, statistically speaking, if you want to. So what does that tell us? Well, overall, these numbers in here indicate fairly neutral conditions in the SOI realm out in the tropical Pacific. It's not really strongly positive like we saw in September. That was pretty high, and that's when the La Nina really started to crank. And then we lost a lot of ground as the pressure field changed in October, and November was real close to neutral. And so if we look at this on a larger scale, right now the pressure pattern still generally favoring easterly wind flow across the tropical Pacific here, but it might be that it is starting to slow down a little bit. Normally when we have much lower pressure in the western Pacific over here, and I'm generalizing this to just help explain it, that's when you get your positive SOI numbers, when the lower pressures remember, high pressure moves towards lower pressure. So when the pressures are lower over here, your net flow of air across the tropical Pacific will be in that direction. And so we might be losing that just a little bit. And so the water is able to maybe pool a little bit more here. Some of this warmer water in the western Pacific around Indonesia and parts of the Philippines, near the Philippine Sea, and really closer to the equatorial region, maybe starting to downwell just a little bit. And I'm getting pretty complicated, probably losing you already, but what does all of this translate to? Well, the signal has meant more of this, okay? And what is this? More oranges showing up. So when we had a much stronger SOI, we had a lot more blue sitting in here, because the pressure pattern, and this is just a cross-section of what I just showed you, the pressure pattern when it was very positive, the SOI, meant that we had a pretty good trade wind like this. Well, we may be slackening off on that a little bit. And so we're starting to get more of these warm anomalies showing up here in the tropical Pacific subsurface, and that's what we're seeing. Positive anomalies showing up all the way down 400 meters into the ocean and in the western parts of the Pacific. Now, this isn't very, very strong. Not what we saw in 2015 as an example. That was incredible. So what we'll have to watch for to sum it all up, does the SOI over here go deeply negative, and sustained, which would allow these anomalies here to start basically moving more east and then eventually upwelling on the east side of the Pacific Ocean and then starting to spread out over the surface, meaning we would really lose the La Nina and head more into a neutral to warm pattern. And to really shorten it, will there be an El Nino or not? And all of that I just explained helps us to see that. As I said on my last update, this is our future. All right, you can look into the future. Typically, what happens here will eventually end up over this way in some modified format, but these are all the different things that we can watch on a weekly, bi-weekly, and monthly basis, and it helps us to understand what's happening with the state of the ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And that being said, just recently, early December here, we got an update from the Climate Prediction Center International Research Institute out of Columbia University, and we see that the La Nina starts to fade here, and neutral conditions more probabilistic. And by the time we get to the hurricane season, the chances of El Nino gone down just ever so slightly. This is the 30% line right here, and they've dropped just a little bit. Overall, this is July, August, September, so that would be roughly the peak time of the Atlantic hurricane season. And unfortunately for predictability assurances and, how accurate is this out here, well, that's pretty far out in time. We've seen it where this could be way off and it's actually way up high and we get an El Nino. It could be right on target. But for the most part, everything seems to indicate heading into the season next year, maybe warm neutral to slightly El Nino conditions. We'll have to see. No real alarm bells going off just yet that we're going to be in an El Nino next year, especially when it's dropped just a little bit. But remember, we're in December, and we'll see how this evolves over time. Now let's move on to actual sea surface temperatures, because this here really fascinates me. Here we are in mid-December just about, And there is the 26 degrees Celsius isotherm. I'm not kidding you. That's 80 degrees roughly, 79.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Still very prevalent here. A little tongue of it right up here just off the North Carolina coast. You can get in a boat off of Wilmington or out of Morehead City and Beaufort, out of Cape Hatteras, head out to the Gulf Stream. And I know the Gulf Stream's warm, but I mean, come on. This is 78, 79 degree water. You know, if you went and jumped into that off your boat in the Gulf Stream, it would feel fantastic. That's amazing that it is that warm. Really won't, you know, let's see what it looks like next September, but for the upcoming winter storm season, wow, you talk about available energy. If you had some jet stream baroclinic energy and cold air coming this way with a surface low forming and then going up the coast, tapping into that, whoa, we could have some incredible storms later in the winter season, if winter will ever come on and stay on. It's back and forth. 24 degrees here one night, 55 degrees for the low the next night. It's just wacky. Anyway, the Gulf of Mexico cooling off as it should. No real surprises here. The shelf water up near the coastal area is nice and chilly, so I wouldn't go swimming in that, that's for sure. Your warm waters down here in the Bay of Campeche in the southern Gulf and around to southeast Florida, the Florida Keys, the dry Tortugas, down into the Yucatan Channel and beyond. Really no major cold excursions down like this. We haven't seen just blasting Arctic air spilling into this area with strong winds to mix everything up on a continuous basis. So maybe that's why we're seeing these anomalies hold on, and we'll just have to see, do they hold on for the next 6 or 7 months into the future. So let's switch to lower 48 weather, the second part of what I like to discuss in the off season. The map is not too active. This is our National Watch Warning map. Lake effect snow machine in full force for the Great Lakes in Pennsylvania and New York. Foggy conditions down in Florida, rest of the southeast. From time to time, you get these muggy, for December, overnight conditions with cool air, lots of moisture, and you start to condense out those clouds pretty much at ground level, and that's what fog is. Pretty active, though, in the Pacific Northwest. Now, this is more typical of an El Nino season, where you get these rainfalls. It's a little bit more south that we would expect that. But heavy rain, I mean, look, there's some flood watches in effect for the Northwest California area. All kinds of issues here in the Pacific Northwest with heavy snow, heavy rain, freezing rain at times. In fact, we can look at it on a different representation here. The Sierra going to add to the snowpack, as well as parts of the Olympic range in Washington and Oregon. Basically, your higher mountains of the Pacific Northwest here and into the interior sections, the Wasatch into Utah, and maybe even the Rockies. Hey, you can take all the moisture you can get, and if it's snowpack this time of year, that's great. Build it up, and then you can use it next year and beyond. This is very important when we see this, and especially in a La Nina pattern. Hey, let's take it as long as it's not too disruptive. It's a positive thing. Sometimes bad weather can be positive. Look at this, an Arctic front trying to come down, sort of a weaker version of that here. Rain in the south, some snows in and around the lakes, as I mentioned. But overall, no major, one of those headline-grabbing storm so-and-so going to affect 100 million people. None of that coming up anytime soon. We've got these Arctic air intrusions, and we can look at that a little better on the 500 millibar GFS as I wrap things up. But we don't have this sort of a lobe of the polar vortex, and that's just an atmospheric term for something mentioned a couple of years ago as being some sort of strange, scientific, weird anomaly. It's been around forever, so whatever. Now that we can see it so easily in map form and easily shared on social media, everybody gets all upset about it. But until this dips down over and into the east, or we have a very strong jet stream coming through with cold Arctic air and a subtropical jet, we're just not going to have any major winter storm issues for the East Coast. So let's put this into motion. and watch over the next week. And you'll notice that your huge area of lower pressure up here and the very cold air, this northwest flow, really confined the heart of the cold to the Great Lakes region, such as Chicago, eventually moving over towards New York City, interior New York, Pennsylvania, and parts of New England up here. That's where your coldest air will be, as this northwest flow coming out of Canada is really focused to this region. Notice that the rest of the 48, the lower 48, it's almost zonal flow across, and that's coming, that air mass originating off the Pacific. So we're not really seeing this deep longitudinal trough coming in like this. I mean, clearly, I'm drawing on top of that, and you can see that it's not there. It tries from time to time. These are pretty good intrusions to the upper Midwest up here coming out of Canada. Draw in red, that'll be easier. But we're not getting these deep troughs over the eastern United States just yet. They come in, and then they lift back out as the western Atlantic, southwest Atlantic ridge tries to hold on pretty strong here, keeping these things at bay. So, stormy from time to time, no severe weather to speak of on a wide-scale basis, no tornado outbreaks, and no major winter storms, except out west. That's a pretty big deal with that particular storm system coming in. So anybody with travel plans out there, hey, if you're going skiing, it's going to be perfect for you. Not so much in the Mid-South and the Appalachians and up into West Virginia. You're going to have to use snowmaking, it looks like. The Northeast, though, some of that area, yeah, maybe the skiing will be a little better as you do get some lake effect snows and a little bit of help from Mother Nature. All right, so pretty calm as we head into the last almost 10 days or so, 12 days till Christmas, and hopefully no major travel issues as we get around that time. I'll talk about that more next week, obviously. All right, lengthy, but a lot to talk about. Again, it's not, we don't sit back and do nothing during the off season. And I want to let you know that I am almost done with the latest edition of our Tracking the Hurricanes episode. Remember, I have an 04, 05, and 08. They are on DVD. Most of those content, those chapters are now on YouTube as well. And this one, the 2016 edition, goes all the way back, catches us up from 2009 through the 2016 hurricane season. So it's going to be really impressive, at least I think so, once it's said and done. I'll post a special announcement about that and where you can get a copy of it or watch it in digital format. I can't wait because it's going to be so awesome. It's all in 16:9, high definition. Wow. It's like, yay, finally something that's not a square when you watch it. I'm very excited about it. Have a great rest of your week. As always, thank you for tuning in. I do appreciate you being a part of what I'm doing here. I am Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com, and we'll talk again next week.